John and Emily moved into an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. The house was spacious, with high ceilings and stained glass windows, but it had a strange, pressurized atmosphere. "It's just an old house," Emily reassured herself, looking at the cracks in the walls. John, on the other hand, was delighted. "A little renovation and it'll be perfect," he said, running his fingers along the wood paneling. But on the very first night, Emily was awakened by a sound that sounded like a whisper. She sat up in bed, listening. A rustle, like something was moving inside the walls. "John," she whispered, pushing her husband to her side. He groaned in his sleep and rolled over onto his other side. Emily took a deep breath, trying to convince herself it was just old pipes or mice. But the next day, when John decided to take apart one of the partitions in the basement, he found something horrible. Hidden behind the wood paneling were skulls. Dozens, maybe hundreds. And they were all facing in their direction, like they were watching. Emily screamed. John jerked back, his face pale. But before they could do anything, a thudding, scraping sound came from deep inside the dark opening. Something was there. Something alive. John froze, staring into the darkness beyond the partition. Emily pressed her palm to her mouth, holding back a scream. Are those human skulls?" Her voice shook. John swallowed, leaned closer and reached out to touch one of the skulls. But at the same instant there was a scraping sound. From somewhere in the depths of the dark passage. "It's like claws clawing at stone. We have to go," Emily whispered, backing away. But John didn't move. He stared deep into the opening, his eyes widening. "There's someone out there." Emily grabbed his arm. "Don't you dare go in there." But John, as if hypnotized, reached for the nearest skull. And the moment his fingers touched the cold bone, the skull turned. There was a muffled cracking sound, as if the bones were moving inside the wall. And then a whisper coming from everywhere. Emily jerked back, her breath hitching. "Do you hear that?" John stared frozen at the moving skulls. His lips trembled. They were talking. The whispers grew louder, merging into an agonizing chorus. "They're back. They're back. They're back. They're back." Something hit the partition on the other side. A resounding, heavy thud. And then, again. Boom. 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 Emily screamed, grabbed John's hand, and pulled him away from the basement. But before they could run out, the lights in the house flickered. And there was a creak of floorboards. Someone or something was coming down the stairs. A creak. A step. Another creak. Someone was coming down the stairs slowly, and each sound echoed in the droning silence of the basement. Emily squeezed John's hand so hard that her nails dug into his skin. "Who's there?" John shouted, his voice trailing off. There was silence. But then a voice came. Quiet. Creaky. "You shouldn't have opened the wall." Emily gasped. John stepped forward, clutching a rusty nailer. "Who are you?" A silhouette appeared out of the darkness. Tall. Skinny. The hunched figure of a man with empty, sunken eyes stopped on the bottom step. His skin was gray, as if dried out, and his lips moved like a puppet's that had trouble moving its jaw. "There, outside now," he wheezed. John and Emily looked over at him. "Who's they?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. The old man turned his head, crunching his neck. "The ones you locked in the walls. They were dead, but you gave them new life." Emily stepped back in horror, and immediately felt something solid behind her back. She slowly turned her head. A skull. The same one that had turned earlier. Now it was staring directly at her. Its empty eye sockets. There was something moving behind them. And before she could scream, a black, oily liquid flowed from them. And then the skull opened its mouth. A hoarse, wrenching laugh came from inside. A gust of icy air swept through the basement, and the walls began to move. It was as if something inside was trying to break free. The old man on the stairs tilted his head, looking at them with a sad grin. Now they were hungry. Boom! The partition cracked. Boom! Skulls began to fall out of the wall, rolling across the floor like toys. Boom! Hands emerged from the darkness. Bony, withered, with black fingernails. They were getting out. John grabbed Emily's arm. "Come on." They rushed up the stairs, but there was a shrill shriek behind them. And then the old man's voice. "You can't escape." And before John could reach the door, cold fingers closed around his ankle. The cold fingers clawed at John's ankle, their touch raw, decaying. He screamed and instinctively kicked his leg, but the grip only tightened. "John!" wailed Emily, tugging at his arm. But he was being pulled downward, into the darkness, where the walls continued to move, spitting out skulls and bones, where dead hands protruded from black crevices, hungry for new life. The old man still stood on the stairs, his dead eyes watching them with sad curiosity. "Why are you resisting?" he whispered. John screamed in pain, the clawed fingers dug deeper, and something wet and slippery ran down his leg. He twisted around, grabbed the nailer he'd dropped in his panic, and with a wild shriek struck the hand that was pulling him down. A crack. The arm came off. Without loosening its grip, it twitched as if alive, spurting black slime. John yanked it off his leg with difficulty and rushed up the stairs in a panic. Emily had already swung the door open, screaming his name. But something rose up behind them. A rustle, a scratching. The entire basement was moving. The skulls that had spilled out of the walls began to rise, clumping together into a monstrous construct. Arms, bones, tendons, all of them fused together to form something shapeless, huge. And as John staggered out of the basement, it spoke. "Bring us back. Bring us back inside." The voices of many dead men, merging into one, rumbling and distorted. Emily slammed the door shut, pressing her back against it, her breathing hitching. What was that? John was too stunned to answer. He just stared at his leg, covered in slimy, rotting blood. And then the old house shook, as if it was alive, as if the building itself realized they were trying to escape. "We have to get out," John whispered. But when Emily took a step toward the front door, it slammed on its own and locked. They stayed inside, and the walls began to laugh. John yanked the doorknob with force, but it wouldn't budge. "Open the door, damn it!" Emily banged it on the wood in panic. "Help, somebody!" But there was only dead silence outside. And behind them, laughter, deafening, eerie, coming from everywhere. The walls were moving. Black liquid slowly protruded from the cracks, dripping down the wallpaper, forming twisted, inhuman faces. "John," Emily whispered, clutching at his arm. He turned around and froze. From the floor, from the walls, from the shadows, figures were slowly rising. Bony, twisted, their skin, if it could even be called skin, was black as rotted meat, and their faces. They had no faces. Just naked skulls with viscous darkness flowing from their eye sockets. They moved jerkily, their limbs crunching like parched branches. Their mouths open, but made no sound. Their whispers sounded right in their heads. "We are cold. We're cramped. Bring us back." They were getting closer. John grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen. "To the basement. Are you crazy?" she screamed. "There was a passage behind the walls, if we get through it." Before she could object, the first of the dead rushed forward. John pushed his wife forward and rushed after her. The dead followed. The walls groaned as if they were alive, as if they could feel their movement. As they ran into the basement, the door slammed shut behind them. But that didn't save them. In the darkness of the basement, something was waiting for them. And it was breathing. Darkness. Thick, sticky, as if it were breathing. Emily swallowed hard, clutching John's hand. "John," her voice trembled. But he didn't answer. Because he felt it. Felt that they were here. There was something moving in this darkness. "We have to go," he finally exhaled. They moved cautiously forward, leaving behind the door, behind which the dead had already begun scratching and kicking, trying to break in. The basement now seemed much larger than before. The walls slid apart, going into endless blackness. And somewhere in that blackness, something was walking in circles. A step. 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 "Who's there?" Emily shouted. In response, a quiet laugh. And then a voice, shrill and distorted. "You have no way to go." Behind them, the door shattered. In the gap stood them, the ones that had come out of the walls. Bony, gnarled, their skulls stretched in sinister grimaces. They wiggled their nibbled fingers, black slime dripping from their bones. And they moved forward. Emily screamed. John grabbed her hand, and they rushed into the depths of the basement, to where the walls seemed torn, where a dark passage gaped, leading. But to where? They jumped into it without thinking, and fell into absolute darkness, the void. And the last thing they heard before they disappeared was a whisper coming from everywhere. "You will be one of us." The fall seemed endless. Darkness engulfed them, cold, rotting, alive. Emily screamed, but the sound was drowned in the void. John tried to fumble for her hand, but felt nothing. It was as if their bodies were beginning to fade away, like they were becoming part of this black abyss. And suddenly, boom! They collapsed on the hard, wet surface. Silence. They were in a room. Bare stone walls. A moldy ceiling. A rotten odor, as if hundreds of bodies had been decomposing here for centuries. A mirror stood in the middle of the room. John struggled to get up and helped Emily stand. "Where are we?" Emily slowly approached the mirror and froze. It wasn't her in the reflection, and it wasn't John. There were two skeletons standing there, dressed in their clothes. Their skulls were empty, but as soon as Emily opened her mouth, the reflection repeated the movement. "This can't be." She touched her face, but the skin was still there. But in the mirror was her bone. John stepped forward. This is some kind of illusion." But when he took a step, the mirror shook, and behind their reflections, others appeared. Hundreds, thousands, those trapped within the walls. And they smiled. And then the mirror shattered. A deafening crack, a blinding light, and suddenly they were standing in their home again. The basement was gone. The skulls were gone. The house was clean. It was as if nothing had happened. Emily grabbed John with shaking hands. What happened? He didn't know what to say. Only one thing caught their eye. The mirror. It was now hanging in the living room. And when they looked in it, they didn't see their reflection. Now they were on the other side. From behind the glass, the skulls in the walls were looking at them and smiling. Emily and John stood in front of the mirror, not believing their eyes. There were no reflections of them, just dark silhouettes with empty eye sockets staring back at them from the depths of the glass. Emily slowly raised her hand, and the figure in the mirror repeated the movement. But it wasn't John, and it wasn't her. It was them, the ones who were waiting, the ones who had been trapped behind the walls. And now they were free. "John," Emily's voice trailed off. "We didn't get out." John didn't move. He stared at himself in the mirror, and suddenly he realized a terrible truth. We're already on the other side. Silence. Cold terror enveloped them like a black fog. Emily took a step back. No. This can't be." But then the house spoke. A whisper that came from every direction. "Welcome home." At that moment, the mirror shook again. Cracks appeared on its surface and began to form into a horrible, crooked grin. Emily grabbed John's arm. "We have to." But he wasn't listening to her anymore. He was staring at the mirror. And the figure on the other side suddenly took a step forward. Unlike them, she cast a shadow. "Time to take your seats." And before Emily could scream, the mirror opened, and the shadows burst out. The last thing she saw before their world shattered was her own skull smirking in the broken glass. They were part of the house now, part of the walls. And when the new owners moved into this house and find the old mirror in the living room, the whispering will begin again.